Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. So I've started recording. I will leave a gap and come in with the introduction. In this episode, we discuss Kubernetes and Docker with Ben Neton. Ben is a veteran of the IT operations market, with a 2-decade career across large and small companies like Loudcloud, BladeLogic, Northrop Grumman, EDS, and BMC. Ben got to do DevOps before DevOps was cool, working with government agencies and major commercial brands to be more agile and move faster. More recently, Ben has spent 5 years in product management at Sumo Logic and is now running product marketing for operations analytics at Sumo Logic. His latest project, Masters of Data, has let him combine his love of podcasts and music with his love for good conversations. So, as a fellow podcaster, welcome to The Cynical Developer, Ben.
Thank you for having me on. It's good to be here.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for taking some time out from your day-to-day to come and talk to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's quite a few things in there that jump out at me in your bio. DevOps before DevOps was cool. Now, I've been quoted as saying, "Is DevOps not what developers used to do before we got picky and there was too many JavaScript frameworks that we couldn't do everything?"
you might be right. What is it like? It's always in our industry. It's always this going around. You're like, well, that's what we used to do, 10 years ago in this different way. I mean, it was fundamentally, we had, early on in my career, we had the problem that, everybody was having, that I had, developers that, I had no inclination about what our production environment was. And then I'm over here in the production environment. I was stuck between the people running the production environment and the developers. They both would get angry at me, and I had to kind of like be the peacemaker and make things work. So it was a good experience. But yeah, we didn't have any name for it. We just did it.
Yeah. I've got a .NET Rocks mug from many years ago. They don't give them out anymore for writing in to their show, and that was about what has now become DevOps, and it was about the people in the teams that wear all the hats. And at the time, I was the dev manager, the senior manager, I was the DBA, I was the network guy, I was support, I was everything in that small business.
Yeah,
it's how things have changed. Yeah. You get people now that specialize in CSS, and undoubtedly in a few months' time, there's going to be people that specialize in div placement in HTML. It's getting very, very niche and very specific.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that. It's like it's both getting more specialized, and it's also getting more cross-functional. Because the thing I've also noticed is that there's also this real cultural movement of like grassroots team-based stuff that wasn't necessarily there when I first started out. So it's kind of like you have both going on. You both have these people are specializing in more and more specific things, but then you also have this here at Sumo, we don't have any DBAs, we don't have any network administrators. Like, people just do what they need to do. So it's interesting how it's things have developed over time.
Yeah, and as you say, that there's so much stuff out there as well to get to grips with. We're here today to talk about Kubernetes and Docker. Now we've already done a show on Docker, and even since then I've not had a chance to do much with it.
Yeah,
because there's just so much to pick up.
Absolutely, it's kind of overwhelming, the rate of change right now in that area.
Yeah. So for those that haven't listened to the Docker episode, shame on you for not listening to the Docker episode to start with. But could you give us an overview of what Docker is?
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think part of it is like you kind of start with what a container is, because I've been doing this for a long time. I remember back when virtual machines and VMware was young, and I was just playing around with it. And I think it's kind of a a similar thing where it was a cool technology that evolved at the right time to serve a specific purpose, because it's not like containers themselves is the idea that you would package everything up into a binary with all the dependencies and everything you need to run your application, at least that component of the application together, was not new. It'd been around. I actually remember looking at a company in 2008 that we shall remain nameless, that was basically doing containers and is not around anymore. It just wasn't the right time. And I think what you see with Docker is that, it was a really good implementation of this idea of, okay, one of the hardest things as a developer and then also in operations is keeping track of all the dependencies, like what's all the crap I have to install, like what do I have to keep track of, and being able to take all that and package it together into a nice package that you can put into a repository and you can easily, version, and you can put out, basically keep track, really easily of what's what the changes are. I mean, that was really attractive in and of itself, but Docker came around at the same time that microservices were really taking off, more generally, with the idea that you would just start, getting the components of your application down to the smallest possible, size, to the smallest possible component, and then kind of standardizing how they talk to each other, with the APIs. And I think that's why Docker in itself took off, because it was the right technology when you want to do microservices. Because if you want to make things small and you want to be able to move fast and you want to be able to move, continuous deployment and whatever other buzzwords we want to use, but basically the idea, you want to be able to move faster and get code out faster. It was the right technology at the right time for that. And I remember when I've been now at Sumo Logic for almost 7 years, and I mean, Docker wasn't even a thing when I first got here, and it took off very, very quickly. And I think it's precisely because of that. It had the right community, it hit at the right time, and it was the right technology kind of answering a question that a lot of people had at that point in time.
Sure. Yeah. So for anyone that hasn't used it and has maybe used other stuff, virtualization, it's probably the next step on from the likes of VMware and Hyper-V and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when I've trained people, internally on this, it's like you're just keeping you keep abstracting more away. Like what virtual machines did really well was saying, hey, why do I keep worrying about this hardware? I remember when I was starting out, you'd have these a couple $100,000 servers that were almost sitting idle. And the idea that you could, virtualize a server and get more stuff on that box was just, absolutely amazing. And I think with, containers, now you're like, well, I'm using the same operating system over and over again. Why do I need to keep track of that? So you moved a little further up the stack, and it's all about removing the variables and making it, removing the number of things that you have to keep track of, because that's usually what causes problems, is all the stuff you have to remember to change and automate.
Yeah. So when you set up a virtual machine, you have to install the operating system. You then have to install, from a .NET world, you'd install IIS, then you'd install the .NET framework, and then all the other things that you'd need to put on there to run your application. Whereas Docker, you don't even need to worry about the operating system as such. It's all taken care of for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is Docker on its own as virtualization. Now, I've also mentioned the word Kubernetes. Could you go into what that is? Is that Docker, or is that Docker Plus?
It's a good question. What's funny of we were laughing a few days ago because there was a Dilbert cartoon with Kubernetes in it, and I'm like, now Kubernetes has hit the mainstream if Dilbert's writing about it. It's just
yeah, I think I saw that, yeah. And now it's mainstream. It's not cool anymore. We need something new. We need the next thing to move on to.
Right.
It's like when people when you walk down the street and you heard people talking about BitTorrent. It's like, well, those days are gone. That's going to get shut down now.
Yeah. Not doing that anymore now. It's like when my parents got on Facebook. But yeah, no, I think there's a couple different angles of coming at Kubernetes, because Kubernetes kind of entered a pretty crowded field at first of trying to solve a specific problem that as you and I were kind of talking before, you've experimented with Docker. A lot of people had. It's the same way with virtualization. I used virtualization when I first started out with VMware. I was just like so I could run stuff on my laptop with, and you shut it on and off, and you could do the same thing with Docker. But when you get to decide that I actually want to run this in production, what you find is that the scale and complexity of running containers, when you do containers as they're designed to be done, which is really, microservices, and you're running a lot of very small components, and you're running them at scale, it just becomes a pain to manage. There's a lot to keep up with. There's a lot that you have to basically orchestrate, right? And that's where you get the orchestration platform. It's like, I need this conductor. I need this like thing that is actually going to know where to put the where to put the containers, where to run them, when to bring them up, when to shut them down. And it's very similar to the same thing, as since we talked about virtualization, it's very similar to what happened there when you moved from just plain old, a VMware virtual machine, and then you got, the hypervisors and all these different things. And their purpose was to help you use it in production. So VMware didn't really become a production thing until you got the hypervisor, and the same thing with Hyper-V and all these other ones. It's the same thing with Docker. It was a really great technology. People really wanted to use it, but you needed this other, thing to run it in production. So fundamentally, Kubernetes was in that same, place as Mesosphere, and there were a couple others out there. And it was basically this, like, how do I actually run this in production? And I think what made Kubernetes really interesting is that, it came out of Google. Google's been using containers for a very long time, before the rest of us really, thought about containers. And they have been running at a massive scale, as you would expect. And they had this thing called Borg. And so, as all nerds, we name it after the television show we like. So they named it after Star Trek, the Borg, the kind of, pseudo evil, you guys that fight around those giant cubes, but basically they had experimented a lot internally running this system, being able to run containers at scale, and then they made a decision that this should be open source. We should we should get this outside of the walls of Google. They gave the people that worked on it kind of like free reign to go create an open source project. And long story short, they came up with Kubernetes. There's a lot of fun lore to have with it. We actually learned as part of the process here, like learning more about it, that apparently it was originally they had a code name for it. It was the friendly Borg, like the blonde Borg woman, the 7 of 9. They named it. It was named after something like that. So there was a code name for it, and that's why the Kubernetes wheel has 7 spokes on it. So I hear. But Kubernetes is basically probably a Greek word for helmsman. So it kind of goes back to this whole thing with, with Docker being like the whale, and then, container ships and all this kind of that same terminology. Kubernetes kind of followed in a different way for that. But I think the really smart thing that Google did is they took Kubernetes, this open source project. They essentially helped create a foundation, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and to house it. And then it became kind of this best practice spot for Kubernetes and all its friends. So it was all these different technologies associated with Kubernetes. And what was really interesting about it is it became a very active project very, very quickly. I mean, was only released a few years ago officially. And they put in this foundation, and we were actually looking at the stats just the other day. And it's almost as active as Linux itself. That's the kind of activity you see in Kubernetes. And so I think that says a lot of why why Kubernetes has been so popular so quickly, is because it really, again, it hit a need. There was this huge need around, everybody wanted to run Docker at scale. They wanted to run containers at scale. They were trying to do it. They weren't having a lot of success. Personally, I had very few of our customers that I would talk to that were actually doing it at scale. And then suddenly Kubernetes comes from, basically it seemed like nowhere, and caught on very quickly. And I think it was because of, the backing of Google and people knowing that, Google did this. And then, from then it's just become this kind of phenomenon, because I think it answered a very specific need that, was kind of blocking people from, running this for real.
Yeah. So the reason that Kubernetes exists then is that to run Docker in production effectively, is a minefield. It's too complex, and this just helps you to do that. Then
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I mean, fundamentally, it's on one level, it's the same reason why you had a lot of these other automation and orchestration tools that one of the companies you had mentioned in my intro was BladeLogic, and the company I worked at, and it was all about automating servers and virtual machines back in the day. And I think it's the same kind of need where you don't want to be manually doing this. That's one part of it. You don't want to be manually orchestrating all of this activity. But the other part is that I think what people didn't immediately recognize with containers is that because you're bringing things into smaller boxes and you can run this at a bigger scale, the complexity of running these things is actually an order of magnitude more complicated than virtual machines, for sure.
Okay, so as well as that complexity, it's called Kubernetes, which is half a mouthful. People often refer to it as K8S or Kilo 8 Sierra. What's that
Oh, I
about?
like the Kilo 8 Sierra. That's a better way to say it. I've heard a lot of people say Kates or K8s, and it seems to make technical people very angry. It's basically because there's 8 letters between the K and the S. I honestly, I will admit that I thought it was something else. I thought it was because it kind of sounded like Kubernetes. No, it's because there's 8 letters between the K and the S, and I think that's a bit of a Silicon Valleyism. Like we have a particular venture capital firm that people might have heard of called Andreessen Horowitz, and they call themselves A16Z. So I think it's just a bit of a kind of a thing going around here. But as you say, it took me a while to remember how to spell Kubernetes. So knowing that you can say K8S and people know what you're talking about is helpful in that way. I don't have to type that word so many times in everything I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky, I think, for some people. And as developers, we're all pretty lazy and like to do things as quickly and as shorthand as we
absolutely.
As we
That's a useful kind of lazy, I say.
Yeah. There was definitely a question I think I posed somewhere along the lines, which was, "Am I being lazy, or am I just being effective?" It may have even been a question I put on Stack Overflow back before Stack Overflow was the pool of hate and question moderators that it is today. So we've got Kubernetes. Now, I've also heard about Docker Swarm. Is that similar to Kubernetes, or is that something different?
Yeah. I think it to some degree it is. I mean, there's a that, as you would expect, that need of the orchestrating, of taking what you would have to manually do yourself, of like orientating and moving these containers around. You don't want to do that manually. Docker Swarm is off, also kind of handling the same thing. I think what you see is that you're always going to see different people use different technologies. There's actually several, that Mesosphere is still around, though Mesosphere is actually moving to be more based on Kubernetes now. What the interesting thing is like taking a step back is, again, because of that community, Kubernetes has kind of, in some sense, wormed its way into a lot of different places, in the sense that a lot of the actors that were basically had different orchestration platforms have essentially embraced Kubernetes, which is very interesting because that's not what has usually happened in the past. I think with Docker, if you go to DockerCon, Kubernetes is everywhere, just like Docker Swarms. I think there's kind of a symbiosis there. But what I've heard is that a lot of times it depends, as you would expect with any one of these containerized technologies. It depends on what you're trying to do, because if you're really looking to run containers at scale, in a real production environment, usually Kubernetes still seems to be the way to go of some flavor, and there are many different ways to run it. Docker Swarm, though, can be simpler, which can be one of the problems with Kubernetes, is that fundamentally it is complicated. It can be hard to learn, and of course there's going to be a whole industry around just learning Kubernetes. But I think sometimes people can find Docker Swarm easier to get up and running, and it can serve a lot of the same purposes. But I think that at least what I've seen is that the general rule of thumb is that Kubernetes is like the way to go if you're really going to run this at scale. But if you're just trying to get something up and running quickly, or you're running at a smaller scale, then maybe there's some other ways to do that. And if you're already kind of in the Docker universe and you're already familiar with it, and Docker Swarm can be a great solution for that. And again, like all things, this is going to be different. People are going to be pulled in different directions, and there's nothing wrong with that. A little bit of diversity is always going to be good in this instance.
Sure. So you mentioned there that Kubernetes can be complex, and earlier on we talked about hypervisor, and I think hypervisor has a nice little application you can use to manage your VMs. Is Kubernetes that sort of thing? Do I install something locally and I can connect to a server, or is it some sort of script thing that I use, or do I have to look for a host that is a Kubernetes host and I get some sort of web dashboard to manage my Docker instances?
It's a good question. So I think on the the most basic level, there's a couple different components that as you would expect with something that is this complicated. There's not this one component, and it's the same thing that happened with hypervisors. Like you could just set up like one host with virtual machines and you were done. But as soon as you go across multiple hosts, you have to have more of this kind of multifaceted approach. So with Kubernetes, you're going to have multiple different components. You're going to have the master, and then you have the nodes that actually run it, and you have different components underneath it to handle different things like the scheduler, and there's all these different pieces that are kind of associated with that. So if you set it up from scratch, there's a few different components that you're going to have to get up and running. And the good thing is that there's a lot of really good documentation and tutorials out there to get going, but there's a lot of different components. Whereas I think some of the other things that are in the container universe, like, from the very simplistic, when you talk about like AWS, like the ECS, or, the Azure App Service, and there's like other different flavors out there, you just put a container on there and it's taking care of all the complexity for you. But the thing is, you don't have as many options and you're somewhat limited in what you can do. With Kubernetes, you get the options and you get the control, but then you get the complexity. And I think this is natural. It naturally happens in technology. Most of the time is that if you want the control, and and as you move up in terms of scale, then you also have to accept some of the complexity. I think Kubernetes is the same way. The good thing is that from where it started to where it's at now, in particular, there's some pretty well documented tools to use. You now got things like Helm and things like that to help kind of ease the deployments. There's also a whole community of different both open source and vendor-based tools that will help you manage Kubernetes itself. So, people might be, on using other, technologies that, hook into it, like Pivotal or something like that. And then there's also, this would be a much longer discussion, but you get into Istio with service meshes, and there's a whole, kind of universe of things that go along with Kubernetes. But I think what matters is that, Kubernetes are multiple different components that you have to manage, that you have to keep track of. And if you're just looking to do something really simple, you're probably better off, picking one of the, just more straightforward services, get your feet wet, understand what containers do for you. And then once you're ready, then you kind of pick up Kubernetes.
Sure. Yeah. So one of my next questions was going to be, what's the benefit over Kubernetes, over just building your apps and maybe throwing them into something like an Azure App Service? Does it give you automatic scaling, or what? Apart from being able to manage Docker images a little bit better, what are some of the benefits of using Kubernetes?
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, if you're using something like Azure App Service, or you're using AWS ECS, or like there's a lot of different flavors out there. Google has its own flavor. For something simplistic, this mattering, like I want to have my containers in a repository and I want to be able to manage them and get them out, and this is what it's going to look like. Kubernetes, might not be the right thing for that. I mean, one piece is that just when you're scaling past a certain point and you need the flexibility, Kubernetes is going to give that to you. Now, what I also think is really interesting in this area, and I've actually we just finished our user conference at Sumo Logic, so I've had a lot of conversations this week with the people actually doing this every day. And another big trend is multi-cloud, because like one thing you'll see that has happened around Kubernetes is So there's two kind of trends going on, right? Like, so everybody wants to be in the cloud. They're trying to move their stuff to the cloud, but there's barriers there because it's there's different standards across the different cloud providers, and where do I get started, and what, like, how do I move my entire app to the cloud? And there's been this very well documented examples of companies flubbing this at massive scale, right? And so I think there's a lot more conservatism around how you move to the cloud. So there's that piece, and that's one of the reasons why you've seen, and I think it's very, very interesting, is you've seen all that. You expect Google to embrace Kubernetes because they birthed it, but both Azure and Microsoft Azure and AWS have embraced it as well, and kind of as is. And we can talk more about that. But the thing is, they've embraced it. They even have, like, they're trying to be an active part of the community, and I think they're doing that because, number one, they see that Kubernetes is actually an easier way for their clients, their enterprise clients in particular, to move to the cloud. Because, like, if you install and operate Kubernetes locally, in your own environment, then it's much, much more easier for you to move it to the cloud. But the interesting is, and I think this is also why they adopted it, is because effectively Kubernetes is probably the best thing to come along so far that can make the dream of multi-cloud come alive. It's the thing that all the executives want, and they say, well, I want to be on lots of different clouds, and I want to be able to, whatever. But it's very hard when you're actually doing this, as any technologists would know, because they are not only do they have different names for things, but in Azure, Blob is nothing like S3 when it comes down to it. And, like, there's all these different technological standards and different services, and not all the services are exactly the same. And I think one of the promises of Kubernetes, though of course there's a little complexity beneath the surface, is that Kubernetes is fairly consistent across the the three major cloud providers and locally, and all these other different kind of the ecosystem. So if you run Kubernetes locally in your own data center, in the closet, or wherever you're going to run it, on your on your laptop, and you learn how to run that, it's actually not going to be significantly different if you run on one of the major cloud providers. So what it means is this: as you're trying to figure out how you can actually not be locked in, and have the opportunity to move your application across these multiple different cloud providers, Kubernetes actually does provide a potential road to that. So I think that's one of the reasons why this has been a very different adoption cycle that you've seen with the cloud providers, because, like everything else, for the most part, all the major cloud providers would have created their own version of it and named it something different, and it wouldn't be really compatible. And I think that's how Kubernetes has been very different. It's actually fairly consistent. These companies are actively participating in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation that I mentioned earlier. It just feels, and it seems to act very differently. So if you're thinking about adopting Kubernetes, that can be very attractive to you, because that, look, I kind of make the transition once. I learn how to use this platform. I learn how it works. I learn how to run containers at scale, and then I'm not having to readapt myself every time I want to potentially move out to a different provider.
Sure. So you mentioned sort of briefly there that what people will know as infrastructure as code. Does Kubernetes support that? Can you do that, or do you have to manage it all through some sort of console?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. So you can effectively describe to Kubernetes what you want it to do, and to describe how you want your deployments to act as essentially code or configurations. And there are consoles that it has that you can interact with it, and a lot of command line tools and everything like that. But fundamentally, Kubernetes, because if you take a step back and you think about where it's coming from, and it's coming from the bosom of Google, Google's kind of site reliability engineering culture, which kind of came out of this idea of, like, having an engineering oriented, almost kind of an engineering first approach to operations, with the idea that the people building this were developers as much or more than they were operations people. That's where Kubernetes came from, or, like, particularly the Borg, which then created Kubernetes. So Kubernetes was built with the idea of automation, with infrastructure as code, with continuous integration, continuous deployment, it's very much built with that in mind, and kind of learned some of the lessons that we've learned over the last decade. So, very much so. So I think, people, that's probably one of the attractions of Kubernetes itself, because it's, to some degree, it's kind of the end result of a lot of what's been going on in the last decade of trying to make these things real. So you're going to get the full benefits of automation of infrastructure as a code, and then you can kind of integrate these with these other services that you're using pretty easily.
Yeah. So you mentioned as well that it's supported by AWS, it's supported by Azure, it's supported by Google Cloud, which is really good. I've got a few clients that they want to do cloud, but they're not there yet. And
Mm-hmm.
some of the processes that I've been going through with them is during development is how we actually structure our code, that we're going for self-hosted right now, but we're going to build this in a way that we can swap everything out and we can go with whatever cloud provider you want in the future. And some of the
Mm-hmm.
listeners might be thinking, well, that's just dependency injection and version control, and it is. It's exactly what it is, but not everybody is doing that. So it's one of those learning curves for a lot of businesses. Now, if one of these clients wanted to start doing Kubernetes, but maybe for whatever reason they can't go cloud yet, could they host this stuff themselves on their own dedicated boxes and then move that to cloud later on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the that's one of the major attractions of it, because let's be honest with ourselves. Google didn't just do this out of the goodness of their heart. They also realized that this was a way of increasing their relevance for the enterprise community, right? So they did realize that if they created a platform that would help enterprises, not just small medium-sized businesses that can kind of tackle these things quickly, if they got something out there, a platform for the enterprise that would help them adopt enterprise microservices in the cloud, that would end up benefiting them. And I think that's proven true. I think GCP, Google Cloud Platform, is actually increasing in its popularity, and it's hard not to attribute some of that to Kubernetes. So absolutely, you can run. I mean, Kubernetes is open source. Google gave up ownership of it to the CNCF as part of the Linux Foundation, so it's like a normal open source project. It's very active, and there's a lot of people running this locally in their own data center. And again, I think that's one of the attractions here, is that you can potentially standardize on Kubernetes, or one of the derivative platforms from that, and standardize on that both in your local data center and in the cloud, and actually get some continuity there. And the reality is that even if you are going to move to the cloud and you are in the cloud, there's a lot of businesses out there that will never be able to go 100% cloud. So there's attraction here to be able to have a consistent platform between the two. And in some sense, again, hark back to virtualization. That's kind of what virtualization was supposed to provide, but in some sense, virtualization kind of ran into this whole problem of like being server based, and there's a lot of configuration and automation and scaling problems with that. And so containers provided a way forward, and Kubernetes provides kind of a consistent way of doing that. And even if you're deciding to go further on into the awesomeness of serverless or whatever it is, a lot of those are derived from this kind of same background anyway. So there's kind of a continuity there. So if you're now, like you said, one of your clients is really considering doing this, a really good way to start is Kubernetes. And again, that's why you see all the major cloud providers actually actively trying to get involved and help their clients and potential clients to set up Kubernetes locally in their data center, which is a little bit mind-boggling when you think about it. That and I have somebody from Amazon actually encouraging me to set up Kubernetes in my local data center, but they realize that that's going to make it easier for you to move to the cloud, so they're going to benefit from that.
Yeah. Now, when we were talking about it being cross cloud compatible, so it'll run on Google Cloud, Azure, and Amazon Web Services, that they were almost identical. Is that the same for self-hosting? Is is there any tweaks I'm going to need to do to my Docker images, or can I just lift and shift and it's going to work no matter where I put it?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there's always going to be some complexities that you'd have to work around, but yeah, for the most part, yes. Yeah, if you're able to run it, locally, it's going to be pretty close to what you're going to be able to do in the cloud. And I think because the services get abstracted away, and AWS EKS, so the hosted Kubernetes, because the thing is, you can also just install Kubernetes yourself in one of the cloud environments, and it's basically the same thing. But if you have AWS EKS, Azure AKS, and then Google GKE, so they're kind of hosted Kubernetes systems, they take away some of the complexity of Kubernetes by managing part of it for you, but still fundamentally, you have access to a lot of the functionality, and it's going to look basically the same. So whatever containers you built should, for the most part, come over. And like always, there's going to be slight differences, but this is a far cry from the fact that, look, if I build something on AWS and I hook deeply into all of their services, it can be quite a challenge to move over to Azure or GCP because the services just don't look the same. So what companies have tended to do is they don't necessarily have applications that easily move between them. They tend to kind of have different silos. So in this case, yeah, if you design something to run like this, it should work the same. And I would caveat that with what I think you're kind of referring to before. Part of this is also, it's not a Kubernetes thing. It's a culture and process and architecture thing. It's like you're going to get the best bang for your buck out of adopting something like Kubernetes by also thinking about the way you build applications, how you architect them, and how your teams work, because they're going to work best with kind of a microservices distributed approach, with kind of a team-based, call it DevOps, call it whatever you want, site reliability, but kind of that approach where, that's how you're going to build your application. So again, it's going to benefit you if you start that process earlier, even if you're not quite ready to go to the cloud, and then that'll kind of work consistently. And then I think what I've heard from some of our customers is that then they feel like that gives them confidence to move between the different cloud environments. So now they can, they can to some degree play the cloud providers off each other a little bit and try to get a better deal by saying, hey, look, it's not actually that complicated for me to move from here to there.
Yeah.
And that puts a little bit more of the control back in their hands.
Yeah, and it's another step away from the developers holding their hands up during the dev process, going, well, runs on my machine. Because with this, it should run on your machine, it should run on his machine, on her machine, it should run in the cloud, and it should run on absolutely everything that can run Docker now.
No, absolutely, and that's a really good point that I didn't mention. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is part of the benefit too, right? Is that your Kubernetes, pre-prod development environments are not drastically different from your production. I mean, as you scale, there's different things that you need to do and different things you need to think about, but fundamentally the Kubernetes is not drastically different as a very small deployment and a very large deployment. So you're exactly right, is that if I can get this running in a test cluster, I can run, have containers even on my laptop or in like small instances in the cloud, and then I move it to the production environment, you can have a lot more confidence that things are going to work pretty smoothly along that whole deployment release pipeline.
Yeah, and I guess on the same vein is that if you are developing something for specifically for Azure, you might be looking at installing the Azure SDK and everything locally, which is a big resource. Getting the Azure development stack. Sorry, I think is the correct name for it. I assume there's one for AWS and possibly one for Google Cloud. You don't need to worry about having all three of those installed and conflicting and causing you an absolute nightmare.
Exactly.
You can just install this and get on with it, which is good. So, as a developer that's not really done a lot with Docker, and I would imagine a lot of our listeners probably are in the same boat, is there a big barrier to entry for Kubernetes, especially for those that have not used Docker before?
No, I don't think so. And one of the benefits here is like if you were trying to experiment with Docker, 5, 6, 7, like I guess like 6 years ago, it would have been a different story as because it was a new technology. It was, everybody was kind of learning together. I think the good point is, particularly for Docker, there's a lot out there, a lot of really good material, a lot of places you can go learn. And I've taken advantage of these myself, and Kubernetes is no different. I think the interesting thing is that, well, I guess you could say the positive part of this is not only is the technology moving, I think the community is responding with different materials. So not it's not just so you're going to be on your own and kind of like good luck. There is a lot of really good tutorial content out there. There's a lot of good example projects to run. Kubernetes' own website is actually really good. We internally here use Linux Academy a lot, for example, that has a lot of really good, and we've used that to train up our own technical teams here to use it, and it's been a lot faster transition than I've seen for other technologies we've tried to adopt. So we have a lot of people that feel pretty comfortable with Kubernetes here. So I think it's not an insurmountable thing, and most of the feedback I've heard is that once you get used to it, actually can be a lot easier because things are actually built to be automated. They're a lot more developer friendly, which is what you would expect from Google in that instance. So no, I don't think the barrier is that big, and there's really no reason not to just go play with it and try it and get up and running. Because I mean, if nothing else, it's a good career move because it's going to look really good on your resume if you have know more about Kubernetes and you have a good feel for it.
Sure. So you also made a lot of references to Linux. Is this something that I could run on a Windows box or even a Mac box?
Yeah, I mean, I believe there's definitely ways to do it. I mean, I don't think that's not going to be a barrier either. I think the good thing is that the community is pretty broad, and there's a lot of different ways to implement it. So that shouldn't be a barrier either.
Awesome. So you mentioned there that the Kubernetes site is really good, and the there was the Linux website for Linux Academy.
Linux Academy is one, and there's other ones like that. That's the one that came to mind because we use that ourselves. But there's other ones like it that I think are really good. And I was actually kind of preparing for this. I went and looked at back some of the stuff we recommend for our own internal people, and all the major cloud providers have really good documentation. I mean, it's to their benefit to help people adopt Kubernetes again, like we were talking about before. So all of them have really good documentation. Kubernetes website itself has CNCF is a really good community. They have their own conference like KubeCon. There's one in Europe. There's one over here in the US. And so there's a lot of really good opportunities. And then, one of the fun things too is like we hear it as part of our release at Sumo Logic with our new Kubernetes solution. We released a new certification, as part of it to try to be. And I think a lot of other, companies and partners in different parts of the ecosystem are doing that. So there's a lot of really good places to start, and you kind of start for where you're comfortable, and then find the stuff related to that. And there's no dearth of like good material out there to learn.
Sure, fantastic. So that really sort of, I think, wraps it up for today for us. It's been really interesting, and I think it's something I need to take the time and get my teeth into it. And I think this may be the piece that I use, because I've mentioned before I use Docker mainly to run SQL on laptops and things, so I get all my resources back. I've not built anything that actually runs in a container as of yet, but I am currently developing some microservice systems, so naturally they should be thrown into some Docker containers. I think that's a good enough excuse for me to start experimenting with this.
Oh, I'm glad I could help give you motivation to do that.
yeah. It's one of the benefits to running this sort of podcast is that as well as helping everyone out there who's listening to learn something new, I learn something new and I get a little bit of insight, and I work out whether this stuff is good for me. Does it solve any of my problems? So it's a win-win situation from where I am.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so just leaves me to say thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom on Kubernetes.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate you having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, not a problem. And everything that we've referred to in the show today, we'll get in the show notes, and we'll get a link through to your podcast as well. We'll share the love a little bit. It'd be great.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Not a problem. And to everyone out there, thank you for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Ben Neton talking about Docker and Kubernetes. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.